Welcome to episode 251 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Kurt McKenzie, who served in the FBI for 24 years. For the first 3.5 years, he was an FBI forensic biologist analyzing DNA evidence. And for the last 20.5 years of his bureau career, he was a special agent investigating out of the Miami division financial crimes, drug trafficking, terrorism, and organized crime. On this episode, Kurt reviews Operation Oxy Alley, a multi-agency investigation of Florida pill mill clinics illegally distributing painkillers. The 4 clinics he investigated prescribed more than 20 million pills and profited more than $40 million. It was the first large-scale investigation to target pill mills as an act of organized criminal conspiracy. The case was featured on the CNBC TV series American Greed. Later in his career, Kurt served on investigative squads working transnational organized crime and transnational narcotics. After being promoted to supervisory special agent, Kurt led a joint interagency task force investigating high-profile transnational organized crime and major theft operations. While working these international assignments, Kurt was frequently deployed all around the world, earning commendations for investigative excellence and leadership, including the FBI Medal of Excellence in 2018 and Outstanding Federal Law Enforcement Officer in 2017. This is a fascinating look at pill mill investigations. I hope you enjoy it. This is also the first episode edited by Dan Keck, my new podcast editor. I want to thank you for helping me hire him and freeing up some of my time so I can write by donating to my Buy Me a Coffee campaign. You're the best. If you're looking for a podcast editor, let me know and I will put you in touch with Dan Keck, who I think is doing a fantastic job. I also want to remind my reader team members to look out next week for my February monthly email. I share some changes made in the FBI agent hiring program and tell you where to send in questions for an upcoming recruitment update episode with my favorite FBI applicant coordinator, Special Agent Serena Coughlin out of the Philadelphia Division. I also review a funny FBI family movie for FBI policy and procedure accuracy. Of course, I want to welcome new listeners. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there are links to where you can buy me a coffee, visit my website to learn about my nonfiction and crime fiction books, and to join my reader team to keep up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Kurt McKenzie. Hey, Kurt, how are you?
Good morning, Jerry. I'm fine. It's good to talk to you.
I'm really excited about this one. I had put out a call to action to find somebody to talk about a pill mill case, and it really was just by accident that, we were introduced to each other on LinkedIn. So thanks for agreeing to do this.
And thank you for what you do, and thank you for inviting me to sit and talk about this case on your platform. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so pill mill. Why don't we talk a little bit about what a pill mill is and the ways that the FBI gets involved in these type of cases, and then we'll just get started on your particular case, which I understand you were calling Operation Oxy Alley. Okay, yeah. There's a lot to unpack initially.
Oh, yeah.
We even want to talk about what Oxy Alley is. So
sure.
Where do you want to start?
To address your first question, let's talk about what a pill mill actually is and why they're bad. There are millions of people in the United States that suffer from chronic pain, and there are doctors who specifically pain. Pain management is actually a subspecialty under anesthesia. These doctors are specially trained to use different modalities to treat your pain. First, they figure out what's causing it. They may recommend anti-inflammatory drugs. They may recommend massage. They may recommend surgery. They may recommend opioid. They may recommend all kinds of things. A pill mill, on the other hand, is essentially a scam. You talked about fraud in the beginning. A pill mill, usually the doctors have no idea what pain management actually is. They are actually usually real doctors. And the sole purpose of the clinic is to crank out sales of narcotics, prescription narcotics, in bulk and volume. And usually the people that come there are not particularly concerned about being medically treated. They're concerned about getting their hands on prescription narcotics. And that is the difference between a pill mill and a true pain management doctor. I'll go backwards even further to the bad old days of right around 2007 here in Broward County, Florida. So we're in the greater Fort Lauderdale area. All of South Florida at that time was seeing an explosion in pill mills starting around 2007. At one point, we calculated after talking to the local sheriff's offices that by 2009, there were more pain clinics / pill mills here in South Florida than there were McDonald's restaurants. I want you to think about that for a second.
Wow.
Yeah. It was eye-opening, to say the least. It was a slowly creeping problem that just exploded all of a sudden.
Why Florida?
Several reasons. Florida has a generally transient population, especially this part of Florida. So you get a lot of people visiting to begin with. So at first, to see license plates from Appalachia, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia at first was not really unusual. It became unusual as the volume increased. Second, and probably most important, at that time, Florida was the only state in the country that did not have a prescription drug monitoring program. So in other words, if I'm an addict and I go to Dr. A and I get prescribed narcotics, if I try to go to Dr. B the same day or within a short period of time and get again prescribed the same narcotics, the prescription drug monitoring system would catch that and alert the second doctor. That did not exist in this state. And for some reason, the governor of this state was resistant to having that system put in. That governor at the time was currently Senator Rick Scott. Why that was the case or why that was his opinion, I have no idea. I've never spoken to him. I'm not going to presume to speak for him. But that was a fact here in Florida at that time, that there was no prescription drug monitoring program. Addicts from all over the United States actually knew that, and they would travel here to get pills in bulk.
Well, that answers the question, definitely.
Yeah. The state did eventually pass a prescription drug monitoring program after we made a splash with this case in the media, and I'll talk about that later. They were sort of embarrassed into doing it, if you ask me. But yeah, again, I'll address that shortly.
So the name of the case was Operation Oxy Alley. Could you tell everyone what's Oxy Alley, the significance of the name?
Sure. Oxy Alley came from the fact that the addicts were traveling here, driving over 1,000 miles at a time, one way to come down here to get pills, primarily from Appalachia. I mean, they came from as far west as Texas too, but primarily Appalachia. We were actually shocked to find out that some flew here, but for the most part, these people would drive over 1,000 miles straight to South Florida to get pills. And usually it was either on US 75 or 95. So we referred to it as that became an Oxy Alley. They were going back and forth transporting drugs along the highway. Not only that, but amazingly, Chris George, being an enterprising drug dealer, actually put up billboards along the highway so that he could see where his clinic was and the contact information. In 2007, I was actually assigned to an organized crime squad. Myself and my partner, Special Agent Jennifer Turner, who is the one who started all this, were both assigned to an organized crime squad. We particularly focused on Eastern European and Middle Eastern criminal groups operating here in South Florida. So we dealt with a lot of Russian gangsters, things like that. Luckily, we were assigned to a task force building. And you're familiar with this, so I'll explain to your listeners. Unlike the regular FBI field office, which is primarily FBI personnel, a task force building was, at least our building anyway, was every police department in the county, the IRS, the FBI, the Secret Service, Homeland Security. So multiple federal agencies and state agencies all working together within close proximity of each other, which was great because you share ideas, you learn things from your local partners, and they learn from you, and you work together in a much more flowing and cohesive fashion. than you would if you were confined to the field office. So my partner had been talking to several local police officers and detectives in the building, and they were mentioning this sudden explosion of pill clinics everywhere and all these out-of-state plates showing up. Also, the increase in addiction-related crimes that they were seeing. DUI car accidents, thefts, people breaking and entering, nuisance crimes. And then anytime they would conduct a car stop, they would have 3-4 people in a car. Each of them would have several hundred doses of narcotics in their pocket, but nothing could be done about it because they had prescription bottles with their names on them from doctors. So the police couldn't do a whole lot, and they were frustrated. This was getting worse and worse and worse. By this time now, it's towards the end of 2008, let's say December-ish 2008, Jen decides to open an investigation. Jen and I had both we've been friends for a long time, and we had worked healthcare fraud in the past. And some of the police officers had mentioned that there were some Russian doctors working in a few of these clinics as well. We figured maybe there's an organized crime connection or a healthcare fraud connection, something that we had experience with that we could at least take a look at and turn the attention of the FBI to help with this problem. And that's actually how this started. So the case was open in late 2008. I was not brought on board until spring, give or take, of 2009, when Jen started to realize how big this issue was, and she was going to need help. As you well know, nothing big in the FBI gets accomplished by one person. It's always a team effort.
True.
Yeah, it was Jen and I, and there were several other agents who assisted, but Jen and I were at the core of this as far as the FBI. We brought in the DEA because, for those who don't know, the DEA actually has two functions. They have a regulatory side and they have an investigative side. We engaged Special Agent Michael Burt from the DEA, who came on board the team, and he brought the regulatory folks with him as well to assist, and I'll explain why shortly. Later on, we brought in Special Agent David Keyes from the IRS because there was a lot of money moving back and forth with these groups, a lot of money. We had several assistant U.S. attorneys in the beginning, but the ones who made the biggest difference and took us all the way to trial and after, and did, quite frankly, a phenomenal job. And I cannot say enough about how great these AUSAs were. Assistant U.S. Attorney Paul Schwartz and Lawrence LaVecchio. That was the core of our team as we progressed with this. We decided to focus the investigation not on the addicts themselves. Again, this is the FBI, this is the federal government. We want to cut the head off the snake. We wanted to see what exactly is happening here, because we didn't quite understand what this was. Normal people place what they're seeing in a frame of mind of their experience, right? So you've been to the doctor before, so you know when you go to your doctor, this is what happens there. So we weren't sure what was happening here, so we had to do our usual investigative techniques. So we initiated surveillance. We had partnerships with Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, the Broward County Sheriff's Office, the Hollywood Police Department, several other police departments were all engaged too. They helped us with extensive surveillance on these clinics. They would interview people after, during car stops. Some of the addicts, they would stop during car stops. We also introduced undercover agents and officers. Eventually, we subpoenaed bank records. And later on in 2010, we initiated a Title III interception, a wiretap on the phone of one of the subjects. As we're conducting this investigation, we're talking about 2009 now. The first thing we did was talk to DEA about what exactly was happening here. What was the scale of the problem here? DEA has a system called ARCOS. I don't remember exactly what the acronym stands for, but essentially it's a prescription narcotic tracking system that is unbelievable. It tracks every single dose of prescription narcotics from the time it's manufactured till the time it's dispensed. So DEA knows exactly how many doses of a particular drug are sold, distributed, and where they're sold and distributed. So we were shocked to talk to DEA and find out that during that time, throughout 2009, more than 32 million oxycodone doses were purchased by doctors in South Florida.
Can you compare that to the other part of the state or another state to really give us an idea of, that astronomical number?
Jerry, at that time, more than 90%, almost 95% of all the oxycodone manufactured in the entire United States was sold in Florida. Do you understand that?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Sounds like there was a problem.
There was a problem. To put it mildly, there was definitely a problem. Armed with that information, as we're taking a closer look into the operations here in South Florida, we started to realize that none of these clinics were operating the way you or I think a clinic should operate. You go to your doctor's office, they're going to ask for your insurance information, your Medicare information, Medicaid, whatever. Every one of these clinics operated solely with cash. And they all operated in similar functions. They actually did learn from each other. This was a viral clinic experience, if you will, that they all learned from each other how to do this. On average, you're talking about $200 cash for your initial doctor visit, usually about $50 for an MRI referral, $250 for an initial MRI, and then between $700 and $1,000 for the pills. The people that were traveling here to get these drugs typically also had travel costs associated with getting here, gas, food, hotels, what have you. So I want you to think about that. For each person that came to these clinics, they'd spend at least initially about $2,000. $2,000 usually gets you up to 400 pills, give or take, or more, depending on the clinics you went to. Usually the pills were a combination of oxycodone. Sometimes in some clinics, it was OxyContin and a benzodiazepine, which is a drug like Valium or Xanax, and a muscle relaxant. And you're thinking to yourself, why those drugs? Why that combination? Because every one of these facilities catered to the streets and to the addicts. And the addicts all knew that when you combine a benzodiazepine or a muscle relaxant with an opioid, you get extra high. It intensifies the high of taking these drugs. So these clinics all catered to what the addicts wanted. So in other words, it wasn't doctors using their medical school expertise and their knowledge to come up with the best treatment for a patient who's in pain. It was drug dealing by people with white coats. That's all it was across the board. So as we're looking further into this, we realize that those pills that are being purchased here, the same pill on the streets of Appalachia, West Virginia, Southern Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, which is where the core of the addiction problem in the United States was at that time. Obviously, it's branched out even further. But at that time, a pill could go for up to $1 a milligram. So a pill that you paid $2 or $3 here for, a 30 milligram oxycodone pill, is now $30 or more on the streets of Appalachia. So you could gross up to $10,000 from a trip coming down here.
A little for you and a little for others.
Exactly. We also discovered that these folks were the term they used in those areas of the country was sponsoring. So one guy would come up with cash. He'd put 4 people in a car, pay each person $2,000 a piece, send them on their way to Florida. Everybody comes back. They split their pills with him. He makes a profit from the share that he sells on the street, or she sells on the street. We actually found some ladies running drug trafficking organizations in Appalachia as well. So again, mind-boggling to us. So as we look even closer, we realize that the most prolific clinics here in South Florida was actually a chain of clinics, a couple small pharmacies, and a drugstore were actually being run by the same group, family and friends. Now we roll our organized crime sleeves up and start taking a hard look at this. So we discovered a gentleman named Chris George, and I use the term gentleman loosely. Christopher George was at the time, 30-year-old convicted felon. He had an identical twin brother named Jeff George. The twins' mother, Denise Haggerty, also worked there. Chris's wife, Diana Pavnik. His friend, Ethan Baumhoff, who's a former police officer who became sort of the money man for the organization. Another friend named Derek Nolan, who became an enforcer for the organization, their head of security. Theodore Obermeyer, another friend who's a former cocaine dealer. Daryl Michael Stewart, who's a family member. Chris Hudson, who was a former fraudster. Andrew Harrington, and several others. There was a huge group of friends and family that ran this entire group of clinics together. They started very small. In 2008, they had a single facility, single clinic, less than 1,500 square feet. But within 2 years, they moved to a 20,000 square foot facility. Plus, they had multiple other clinics. They had pharmacies and they had drugstores, all within less than 2 years. And talking back again about the ARCOS system, when we queried ARCOS, we found out that of the top 20 oxycodone dispensing physicians in the country, the top 5 worked for the George brothers. So this was a massive organization with just incredible volume and output. We estimate over the course of 2 years that they were in business before we shut them down, they probably dispensed something like 20 million pills, controlled doses, narcotics. And they took in a little over $40 million in just about 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So as we're looking into them, again, we're conducting surveillance, we're doing interviews, we're doing a normal investigative course of action that you would expect from a typical FBI case. We discovered a pattern of threats, intimidating rivals, extortions, assaults. They actually committed an armed kidnapping at one point, unlawful possession of firearms. Chris was a convicted felon. He wasn't supposed to have a gun. He had few. Money laundering, you name it. And what was more disturbing at the time, we weren't sure of the size of the problem at the time. We were just seeing sort of the nose of the camel under the tent. But we started to get reports from medical examiners all up and down Florida. They'd started seeing increases in drug overdose deaths. And eventually, oxycodone became the leading cause of overdose death in Florida. Ahead of alcohol, cocaine, oxycodone was number one. And we didn't realize this at the time, but eventually we also found out that the overdose deaths in Florida tripled during this time. So tripled. Wow, that's correct. Tripled.
Another clue that something is not right,
to say the least. There were all kinds of things wrong going on down here under the surface. Obviously, we worked very hard, but we started to work with a little more urgency the more we learned of this. In March 2010, March 3rd of 2010, we hit them with search warrants. And the purpose was to shut down the organization and obviously seize evidence and be able to review the evidence. March 3rd, 2010, multiple search warrants, over 200 law enforcement officers, federal, state, and local, fanned out to conduct the search warrants, to seize evidence. We set out interview teams to interview probably 50 different people involved with this group. We seized that day over 28,000 patient files, which is close to 600 boxes worth of documents, and over 400,000 doses of narcotics, and $10 million in assets. Almost $5 million of that was in cash. All right, I want you to think about that for a second. They had $10 million in cash and assets just kind of lying around. As a matter of fact, it's a little aside story I tell people. Chris George's mother had over $4 million in cash hidden in her attic. She hid her son's money for them, some of their money, in her attic. So this little old lady had $4 million in cash hidden in her attic.
Wow.
Just amazing. To go back and explain about the patient files. Why are there patient files if this is a criminal organization? The George brothers actually learned how to set this up from a corrupt physician who's now since deceased. He taught them that of all the people on planet Earth over the age of 25, if you were to do an MRI examination of their spines, you would find some irregularity. Now, mind you, in the vast majority of cases, it is completely asymptomatic, right? There is no pain. But he explained to them that you could use that to support an addict's claim of pain, crippling pain, to prescribe narcotics. And that you needed to maintain a file if law enforcement ever came knocking to show that these people were being treated by physicians. Here's the file. Here are the tests that were being done. Talking about the files they had, we actually took, as I said, we had 28,000 patient files we seized. Our team actually sat down and went through almost a third of those by hand, just to look through and see what BS was actually being written about in these files. One of the things we noticed is that the doctors would have several pages of examinations they supposedly conducted, and they check off these examinations that they conducted. And we went and interviewed real physicians, real pain management board certified physicians who became witnesses for the government, and asked them, how long would it take you if you were conducting all these tests? Says, at least an hour, between an hour and 45 minutes to conduct all those tests. Okay. Well, some of the evidence we seized from the clinic, again, March 3rd, we seize all the evidence, then we have to actually start going through this stuff. The George brothers, Chris in particular, actually set up surveillance cameras within the clinics, not within the examination room, but within the clinic, so he could keep an eye on the madness that was going on. Because if your facility is full of out-of-state drug addicts who are usually high at the time they show up, you kind of need to keep a watch on them. One of the things we could see is when a patient walked into an examination room and when they walked out. So I'm, slightly obsessive compulsive. So I sat there for a week and watched the videos in real time of people walking into the examination room and walking out. The average time that a patient spent in any examination room with any physician in a George Brothers clinic was 3 minutes and 45 seconds.
3 minutes and 45 seconds.
Correct.
That's usually, you're still sitting in the room waiting for the doctor to come in, at that point in any other clinic.
Correct. So 3 minutes and 45 seconds. And usually everybody walked away with roughly the same combination of medication and roughly the same doses, anywhere from 300 to 400 plus pills in 3 minutes and 45 seconds. And by the way, nobody was ever diagnosed with anything. One of the more disturbing things we saw, if you go to your doctor and you have a problem, there's usually a referral. Your doctor will call another specialist, something like that will occur. All the patient files we ever looked at, there was not a single referral or phone call or reference to any other physician for any reason. And more disturbingly, even as a layperson, we saw evidence on some of the MRI reports that these people had serious medical problems that were never treated. Never. Nobody's ever diagnosed with anything, ever. Go in, get your pills, and leave. Chris, to give him credit, was a businessman who wanted this to be as efficient a process as possible. These doctors never actually wrote prescriptions. They had prescription pads, and Chris had rubber stamps created for them. So they just constantly rubber stamping the drug and drug combinations and the amounts. It was a set process. Rubber stamp, get them out the door as fast as possible. And he had an arrangement with the physicians. They were paid per patient. He had a two-part arrangement. One, in Florida at that time, a physician could act as a dispenser, act as a pharmacy, essentially. Their DEA control numbers allowed them to order narcotics from a distributor and have them come to the clinic. So Chris would essentially rent their DEA numbers from them for $1,000 a week. And each patient they came in, he split the profits 50-50. So each $200 patient visit, they'd get $100. Chris would get $100. So you see the tremendous incentive for these doctors to crank out as many patients as possible and truly not care about patient care.
Which is the absolute opposite of what you think about when you think about the type of person who becomes a doctor.
Right. We were shocked. We could not believe what we were seeing. Every culture on earth since time immemorial has put healers, right? The healer is the top of your social order, right? That is the most admired, revered person in your culture is the healer. We as Americans especially are conditioned to think of doctors as, wise and just decent people who are trying to help and heal. None of that ever happened with these people. They operated solely for the purpose of getting cash in their pockets. And what was very disturbing, obviously this entire case was disturbing on many levels, but we ended up in 2011 indicting 32 people in this case, 13 of the doctors that worked there, Chris, his brother, his mother, his wife, all of the friends and family that were involved in this scheme, 32 people altogether. We charged them in a RICO conspiracy, money laundering, drug trafficking conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud. We hit them with everything we had. 28 of them pled guilty and were eventually sentenced to jail. 2 of the doctors actually died before they could be sentenced. They were older gentlemen in poor health. They did unfortunately pass away. But after everybody was convicted, many of them agreed to cooperate. We interviewed several of them. 2 of the doctors decided that they were going to go to trial. I'll talk about the trial shortly. Knowing that we were going to go to trial, we needed to start interviewing the physicians about their conduct in this and sort of get them to come to Jesus and admit their conduct so they'd make better witnesses. I had doctors arguing with me that, well, I'm a doctor and this is perfectly normal. And, who are you? And I said, well, you pled guilty, right? So obviously we have a difference of opinion about your guilt. And if you truly doubt your guilt, maybe you should withdraw your plea and you can go to trial too. Well, I needed the money and I wasn't making enough money. One doctor actually 2 of them actually told me this. They were making between $300,000 and $400,000 a year. At the George Brothers Clinic, they bumped that up to $1.2 million per year. So you see the incentive again to make money. Nothing about patient care, strictly about making money.
If they're only seeing them for 3 minutes and 45 seconds, how many people were being churned through each doctor's room?
The average doctor in these facilities was cranking out 50 patients a day, bare minimum. Matter of fact, if you were slow and lazy, it was 50 patients a day. And they also started seeing more patients once they moved. Luckily, we shut them down shortly after they moved into their largest facility. It was less than 3 months after they moved in that we shut them down because they would have been able to see even more patients. Patients is not even an accurate term. Customers is actually a more accurate term. But they would have been able to increase their volume substantially had they been allowed to continue working in that facility alone. That's not even addressing the other clinics. Going back to the evidence review, one of the disturbing things we started seeing as we were looking through the patient files and before we started interviewing the doctors, we would see this notation DC in handwritten in many of the patient files, or some of the patient files. What's that? It was explained to us that meant discharged. Sometimes some of the people that came to the clinics were in such rough shape that even Chris didn't want them around because he realized that would attract attention. And when I say rough shape, your listeners are probably thinking of pills, you take them orally and that's how you get high. Not in this case. And let me explain to the difference between OxyContin and oxycodone and why Chris and his crew, their facility eventually only sold oxycodone. OxyContin was a time-release formula of oxycodone that was created by Purdue Pharma sometime in the 90s, I believe. Oxycodone had been around for decades. What the addicts realized is that OxyContin could not be crushed and snorted, nor could it be liquefied and injected into your veins, which when you're taking an opioid, the oral route is fine for getting high, but the more intense high comes from snorting or shooting the drugs into your veins. So eventually, a lot of the patients at these facilities would turn to shooting the drugs, not unlike people on the streets with heroin, and they would develop track marks, just like the heroin addicts. So when they came in and they're all full of track marks and they're shaking and falling apart, which is not uncommon, by the way, even Chris would say, hey, you're in too bad shape here. The cops are probably going to pull you over the minute you get out of here, and I'm going to have a problem. So they would discharge these people. But what was more disturbing, we came to find out, is that DC also stood for deceased. If a police officer in Appalachia or in Florida anywhere found an overdosed person, in some cases, they'd find a pill bottle in that person's pocket with the doctor's name and the clinic's name and a phone number and contact information on it. They would reach back out. They have to conduct a death investigation. The name of Chris's primary facility, by the way, was American Pain. Whenever American Pain or any of his other facilities got a call from law enforcement, hey, we found this person dead. We need a copy of their patient file. What were you guys doing with these people? They would make a copy, send it to law enforcement just to show that they were quote unquote legitimate. And then they would put a notation in the file that this person is now permanently discharged, if you will. I want you to understand the ramifications of that. It means that these people knew that people were dying on a regular basis, and they continued to do what they were doing.
I'm shaking my head.
Yeah.
You can't, hear that or see that on the audio, but the whole time you've been talking, I've just been shaking my head. This is unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah. That's how we felt. And this was a 5-year investigation for us, by the way, just emotional up and down with this. We couldn't believe what we were seeing half the time. In addition to what they're seeing in their own files, by the way, there is extensive local media coverage on this problem at the time. In particular, the George brothers and their facilities. Matter of fact, there were at least half a dozen media stories that I remember seeing at the time where they'd be cameras outside their clinics or cameras following them. Hey, tell us about these people who passed away, or tell us about the volume of drugs and these addicts and the people from out of state at your facilities. And they'd avoid the cameras and, no comment. But they knew that there was attention on them, yet this continued.
Did they know that there was a federal investigation going on?
No, they had no idea. They had no idea until we went over with the investigation on March 3rd, 2010, when we served the search warrants. The search warrants were done for 2 reasons. 1, obviously to collect the evidence like we normally do in an FBI investigation. But 2, we wanted sort of a shock and awe factor. Chris was not a nice person. These were violent people. They were causing deaths. We had no idea of the extent of the deaths at the time that we served the search warrants. We figured that out eventually. But we wanted them to know that the entire weight of the federal government was going to come down on them. And we were now in charge, right? Their operation was over. All this was over. One of the disturbing things, again, many disturbing things we figured out as we approached the trial, we decided to randomly pull 300 of the names from those 28,000 patient files that I told you about. Just had an analyst pull 300 names, and we sent those 300 names to the Social Security Administration. As some of your listeners may know, Social Security maintains a master death database, if you will, of, when you pass away, that way it's reflected on your Social Security number, makes it hard to commit fraud with a deceased person's Social Security number. So Social Security came back and told us that of the 300 we sent them, 28 were dead already.
Wow.
So
Almost
if you
10%.
extrapolate, correct. Over the time that they were in business, the George brothers, it's hard to prove, obviously, for several reasons, but they may have contributed to at least 2,800 deaths nationwide.
Again, wow.
Astounding, right?
I would imagine that during your investigation, you either met some of these victims or probably even more so, their family members. Could you tell us a little bit about any of these people? You know, who they are and how they got where they got?
Absolutely. One of the more heart-wrenching aspects of this is obviously we at the FBI tend to do things a little bit different than our local law enforcement partners for several reasons. This was my first experience being sort of a street cop. I'd spent more time interviewing addicts than I'd ever had for any reason. Out on the streets, in their homes, trailer parks, what have you, interviewing severely addicted people, talking about their experience at the clinics, their experiences with addiction, their experiences with the deaths of friends from overdose. And as I mentioned also, one of the things we did is we started looking through the patient files. We advised the doctors before they'd all pled guilty. We advised them that, hey, we'd started looking through the patient files and we're starting to see that some of your patients are deceased. It was an incentive by the US government to get them to plead, with the understanding that if you do not plead guilty to the charges that you're looking at, several of your patients have died from overdose, and we are probably going to revisit that and charge you with that as well. And that was an incentive for several of them to plead guilty. Two of them decided they knew better, and that would be Dr. Cynthia Cadet and Dr. Joseph Castronovo, who, as far as they were concerned, a dead patient is not their fault. And I'm going to say something now that's even more shocking. I'm glad I got this out during a hearing. It's actually, there's a transcript of this. I got this out in open court at one point. Dr. Cadet, I had to testify in a hearing, a pretrial hearing for her, where her attorneys tried to argue that my methodology for examining the patient files and talking to the medical examiners, which I did extensively, by the way, and interviewing family members, was flawed and my conclusions were incorrect. But the fact of the matter is, within the 1 year that Dr. Cynthia Cadet operated, actually she was there a little over a year, but in 12 months of her operating there, 51 of her patients died. Oncologists don't have that many patients die in 1 year. 51 of her patients died of either drug overdose or as a direct result of drug use. It was not uncommon for several of them to die in car accidents, DUI, but 51 of her patients were dead. So we took that. I narrowed it down to the ones that we could charge, right? Because again, you can't just say, well, that person died and it's your fault. I have to be able to prove that. We then turned and pivoted towards a death investigation. How do I prove that these people died as a direct result of what this doctor did? The statute's fairly clear. It's Title 21 USC 846, if I'm not mistaken. It has a subsection that says if you unlawfully give a drug to someone and they die, it is your fault. So we established certain criteria for charging this. One of the things we wanted to prove is that this person did come to the clinic and saw you. So we have a patient file to support that. I would interview the victims' families. I would talk to the police departments, or we would talk to the police departments and get the incident reports. We would talk to the medical examiner's offices or the coroner's offices and get copies of the toxicology reports. And if we were fortunate enough, we would also have video from the clinics, or we would have the actual pill bottle with their name and the American Pain Clinic stamp on it. I would also establish a temporal connection. In other words, hey, this person came to your clinic. By the way, all of the people we charged, they'd come to the clinic. They were usually dead within 24 to 48 hours. And I could prove that, they had not gone to another physician. They came to see you and they died with your pill bottle in their pockets, or they died in a car accident because they were getting high the minute they drove out of the clinic. So we took that information. We charged those two doctors with that. We eventually went to trial in the summer of 2013.
And how many death counts did you include in that indictment?
I want to say the second superseding indictment was a dozen, if I'm not mistaken. It was a dozen because, again, we had to be able to establish all those criteria: the time, the drugs, the prescription, hopefully video, witnesses. We had to have everything together in order to charge. Many of the people who died of overdose either died outside of the time window that we established, or they saw another physician at some point and got more pills because, again, Florida had no prescription drug monitoring program. So we could not, in good faith, charge one doctor when multiple doctors were involved. And also, we couldn't prove, or it was more difficult for us to prove the secondary and tertiary users. Because again, if people are buying these pills and then distributing them on the streets of Appalachia and somebody dies, it's extremely difficult for me to bring it all the way back to one doctor in Florida. So we needed a direct connection to be able to bring that in front of a jury. We went to trial. It was an 8-week trial. I don't need to tell you, that's a very, very long time for a federal criminal trial. At the end of 8 weeks, we charged them with not just causing the deaths, we charged them with drug trafficking, money laundering as well.
Is this trial just with the two doctors? Is there anybody else that is also involved in this trial?
The two doctors were the only two who refused to plead guilty to the other charges.
What about Chris George? They're pleading guilty too?
He'd already pled guilty. Him and his brother pled guilty. They were smart because they were looking at life in prison without the possibility of parole. So they pled guilty and agreed to testify against these two doctors. We put 65 witnesses on the stand. It was an 8-week trial. I testified. My partner, Jennifer, testified. Michael Bird from the DEA and David Keyes from the IRS, we all testified. After 8 weeks was the first time I'd ever come across jury nullification. So the jury was more or less deadlocked on the death counts. And they then pivoted to a not guilty verdict on the death counts, but convicted him of the money laundering. Correct. We didn't know at the time. Again, I was shocked. But we found out after the fact that there were two jurors who refused to convict on the death counts because in their opinions, a junkie is a junkie. It's their fault that they're addicted and their fault that they died, which obviously means that they totally ignored the words and the writing of the statute. But those two held up the entire jury. The jurors obviously were exhausted. They'd been there a long time and they convicted solely on the money laundering counts alone. So I can't tell you how much of a disappointment that was. We knew that we were taking a risk because this is not something that was done routinely. As far as I remember at the time, this was the largest pill case of its kind in Bureau history. It was also the first time that a RICO prosecution had been done of a prescription drug trafficking organization. And charging doctors with overdose deaths, although it's common now, if you look in your press coverage, you can see multiple doctors being charged and convicted of the overdose deaths of the patients. The national attitude has shifted since we initiated this case. But at that time, that was still a prevalent attitude that, you're a junkie, it's your fault, not understanding that addiction is a disease of the brain and that doctors are supposed to be treating disease, not promoting it. And that is how we ended up with that verdict. So eventually, the good news is every one of the 32 people that we indicted was convicted and 30 of them ended up going to jail. As I said, 2 passed away before they could be sentenced. But everybody did eventually go to jail. We shut down the organization. And one of the things I'm most proud of in my career, all of us actually take great pride in this. One of the local newspapers, the Sun Sentinel, put out an article in late 2011, I want to say 2011, 2012, noting that the death rate from oxycodone overdose in the state of Florida alone had dropped 41% after we shut down the George Brothers organization.
Now, that had to be that you were disappointed with the outcome of the trial, but statistics like that have to be so validating for the investigation and all the work that you did.
Absolutely. Now, unfortunately, that didn't last forever, but at least for 1 to 2 years, people stopped dying for a short period of time. Now, as everybody knows, eventually, the term the drug addicts use is, they call it a taste. Once you get a taste of the opioids, you're essentially hooked for life. You're always battling your addiction for the rest of your life. But once they got a taste, the supply was cut off by us. Within a few years, they started to turn to street heroin, and the Mexican cartels and the Chinese pharmaceutical black market all realized that they could make a lot of money synthesizing fentanyl and putting it out on the streets of the United States. And that backfilled and replaced the gap that was created by the slowdown in the flow of pills. And unfortunately, since then, the death rate has continued to climb because the addicts, again, already had a taste and they were still looking.
It's all about supply and demand.
Absolutely. Which is why, I talk about this case. I've talked about it on television before. I've spoken to numerous citizens groups about it. As proud as I am of the work that our team did on this investigation, the tremendous amount of work we did, the solution to the problem of addiction is not law enforcement. The solution is education of the young. It's counseling. It's addiction treatment. It's a whole host, it's legislation. It's a whole host of other methodologies besides law enforcement.
And that makes sense because, as you said, if a person gets the taste, then they're going to do whatever they can to satisfy their addiction.
Absolutely. As I keep using the term disturbing, but there's nothing else to explain some of the things that we learned during the course of this case. So as I said, we interviewed several of these doctors prior to trial to kind of size them up as witnesses and get into their heads a little bit. But one of the reasons this country is having the problem with addiction we have, and I learned this going along during the course of a 5-year investigation, but there's a perfect storm that occurred several years ago, almost 30 years ago. So 3 things happened at the same time we figured out. Thing number 1 is that the American Medical Association and doctors in the United States decided that pain was now the 5th vital sign and that everything and anything had to be done to treat pain. Unfortunately, medical school education taught little to nothing about addiction. Every one of the doctors that we interviewed, all 13 of them who eventually ended up going to prison, had either no training on addiction in medical school or minimal, maybe a 1-hour presentation. And last but not least, Purdue Pharma comes along with OxyContin and aggressively advertises, markets, and lies to the American people that this drug is not addictive. So you have doctors now with little education, little knowledge, and pressure to dispense, having patients come in complaining about pain, and now you get over prescribing. You get people coming in for a toothache being given 30 oxycodone pills, things that should just never happen if people had been properly educated from the beginning.
I understand. I think I saw something, maybe it was on 60 Minutes, about pain management, that in Europe, they dispense maybe 5% of what we dispense here in the U.S., that they use many other methods of pain management and not drugs. They're not dependent on drugs.
Correct. I'd mentioned earlier, I'm not a physician, obviously. I'm not that bright, right? So I have to go talk to people who know what they're talking about. And we found board certified, nationally recognized pain management experts who explained to us how the process is supposed to work. Opioids are not a first resort. Now, mind you, I am not here to say that the FBI says that nobody should ever get an opioid. If you just had surgery and you need 3 days worth of opioids to get you through that initial pain, absolutely. If you're a cancer patient, you're suffering from some god-awful cancer, end-stage rectal cancer, whatever have you, and you're in horrific pain for whatever time you have left in life, absolutely give that person whatever it is they need, opioid-wise, to address their pain and to make them comfortable. What we did try to say with this case is if a doctor is going to prescribe an opioid, how about maybe diagnosing an illness first? How about determining the cause of that person's pain? How about examining other treatment modalities before opioids? How about starting off with a lower dose first and then increasing to a higher dose? I want to give you perspective. Many people have, had oral surgery or something and gotten a Percocet. Percocet, if I recall, is 5 milligrams of oxycodone and 350 milligrams of acetaminophen. What the George brothers routinely did is they handed out anywhere from 120 to 240, 30 milligram oxycodone pills, right? 6 times as powerful as a Percocet. And then they would give you another 60 to 90, 15 milligram oxycodone pills to go with that. And then they would give you anywhere from 60 to 120 Xanax to go with that. And not 1/4 milligram, not 1/2 milligram Xanax, 2 milligrams of Xanax. If you or I were to take one each of those pills in combination right now, we'd be unconscious and probably in the hospital. And this is what these people routinely did on a regular basis, daily. Absolutely shocking.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to hear about how much time they got.
Again, you're an agent. You understand how this process works. As agents, we're aggressive that way. If we investigate and we see what you're up to, we want you to get as much time as possible. If it were up to me, most of the people in this case, including the George brothers, would have been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. But the plea process exists for a reason. With their cooperation and with their pleas, Chris was sentenced to, he got the longest sentence of anybody. He and his brother, I think, were sentenced to 17 and a half years in federal prison. The average sentence for the doctors was between 3 and 6 years was the longest sentence any of the doctors got.
What about the two doctors that went to trial?
I believe Dr. Castronova was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, and Dr. Cadet was sentenced to 5+ years in federal prison.
Wow. So they rolled the dice and kind of won.
Yeah. Much as I hate to admit it, yes. We really had no choice. We had to go ahead with the superseding indictment. We did not realize this in the beginning, but once we saw the extent of the death and the carnage that had been caused, that second superseding indictment was also written, much like the first indictment was, as a reading indictment. We wanted to teach people and let people see exactly what happened here and how horrific this was and exactly what these people did. Because 2 members of the jury were too dumb, quite frankly, to understand that or accept it. I can't help that. Our team did the best that we could possibly do to alert the public to what was going on with this organization and shut them down. And we did that.
I just had to sit with that for a little bit.
It's a lot to take in. It was a lot to take in for us. This case was very difficult, not just physically difficult because of the amount of work we did, but it was emotionally difficult for all of us.
I'm also thinking about the family members who had to be so gratified that this was being looked at by law enforcement and that these doctors were being held accountable and what they must have felt when the verdict came in.
Yeah, that was hard. These people, every one of the addicts whose deaths we charged were poor, right? They're economically disenfranchised folks. They were addicts. They were in rough shape, but they had families and friends who loved them. We interviewed all those folks. They were appreciative that somebody actually cared about their loved one because, society, generally speaking, does not care about poor, downtrodden drug addicts and homeless people. So they were appreciative that we actually tried. And several of them reached out to say thank you, which is tough for me to deal with, tough for all of us to deal with because we wanted a different outcome. But I think we accomplished what we set out to do, which was A, to shut down this organization, and B, to spread the word nationwide, which did in fact happen. We didn't just get local coverage. CNN would show up and cover this too. We made the cover of Bloomberg Business Week. There was a book written about this case called American Pain. From what I understand, there's actually a screenplay written about that too. I've spoken on the television program American Greed about this, and there's at least 1, probably 2 more TV shows coming out about this same case. So we got the word out.
So there was no hiccups? Did everything work perfectly? Were there any issues or anything like that?
To be honest with you, the initial problems we faced went away very quickly. So the initial problems were from our upper management, from the first set of prosecutors we had was, well, these are doctors, right? Yes. They have DEA numbers, right? Yes. It's legal for them to prescribe these drugs, right? Yes. So we had some initial resistance about, is this really a crime?
Did they really feel that way, or were they playing devil's advocate just to get an understanding of your commitment to the case?
That's a great question. I think it was a little bit of both. I think it was a little bit of ignorance as to, again, we were all initially ignorant about this, but Jen was smart enough to look and see something is not right here. This is not right. Something is wrong, and we need to look more closely and see what's wrong. We had some initial resistance that went away fairly quickly once we started explaining to everybody what it is we were seeing with the initial portion of the investigation, with the surveillance and things like that. The U.S. Attorney's Office eventually got us 2 phenomenal prosecutors. Again, as I said, Mr. Schwartz and Mr. Lavecchio. The difficulty that they had the same query from their upper management too, but they also rolled up their sleeves and learned about the science of addiction, the science of, again, we interviewed the pain management experts. They got books. They learned about how these things actually work. When we indicted Dr. Castronova and Dr. Cadet for causing the overdose deaths, they did a brilliant legal move. And that was to hire 2 nationally renowned forensic pathologists to testify in grand jury that these people did not die of an oxycodone overdose, which is obviously blatantly untrue, but they were being paid, whatever they were being paid each. And Mr. Schwartz sat down, he learned the science, he spoke to the medical examiners, he and I had extensive conversations about how this actually works and why what they're saying is BS. And obviously I wasn't present in the grand jury room, and I couldn't talk about that anyway, even if I was, but we still managed to go through with the indictment. So we got a true bill on the indictment initially, despite their resistance. Otherwise, the only issues we had going forward after that were some minor misunderstandings between us and some of the local police departments. As far as manpower, they were contributing a great deal of time and effort from their detectives to help with the surveillance and the undercover work and things like that. And as you know, in big drug cases, when there are cash seizures, Kurt McKenzie doesn't get any of that money. Some of that money goes to help the local police department. So there are some disagreements at first about the percentages and things like that. But all of the issues that we had during the investigation were relatively minor compared to some of the other nightmares I've seen in other investigations. We can't really complain too much. It really was not bad. We had the full support of our upper management, not initially, but eventually, full support and backing of our upper management. The problems with the police departments went away. And on the federal level, we had absolutely no issues between the agencies. DEA, IRS, and the FBI got along swimmingly, just the way they should. You know, you see it in the movies that we actually get along. It doesn't always work that way. But in this case, it did. And we're all still friends to this day. I mean, we are tied forever because of this case.
You'll always be recognized for that work that you did, that powerful work that you did. The war against drugs, continues today in different ways and different levels.
Absolutely.
This has been a fascinating case review. I'd like to give the audience a chance to learn a little bit about how you got into all of this. So I'm asking my standard question of when and why you joined the FBI.
My introduction to the FBI was accidental. I met some agents from the Newark and the New York field offices back in the 1990s. And I got to know them. This was back in the day when you could hand somebody a resume and a phone call would be made. Things were different back then. But they said, hey, you seem like you have half a brain. You seem like a nice guy. You can speak well. You look like you're physically fit. You should really consider working for us. And I was very fortunate. My educational background was in microbiology and biochemistry. I'd been working in the pharmaceutical industry at the time, so I understood the industry. I came from the industry. My first job out of college was working for the company that invented DNA amplification technology, the company that invented the PCR process that everybody's so familiar with nowadays in the days of COVID. Fortunately for me, in the 90s, the Bureau was actually switching over to using PCR as a forensic DNA identification technique, and they were looking to hire people who had expertise. I met these agents. One day I got a call from the assistant unit chief of the DNA analysis unit, and I ended up being recruited and hired by the Bureau as a forensic biologist. I worked in the DNA analysis unit, doing DNA analysis in criminal cases for the first 3.5 years of my career before I left for Quantico in January of 2000. Became a special agent, got to Miami, and had an absolute blast for the last 24 years. It's been amazing.
But why the FBI? Because, you were doing biology. This is a law enforcement agency. How did you make that mental leap of, this is something I could do?
So I want you to think back to the mid-90s when forensic scientists were like rock stars and movie stars. This is right around the time that Silence of the Lambs had come out. There were several reality TV shows, forensic science shows, New Detectives, Forensic Files, all that stuff was blowing up in the 90s. I'd obviously seen those shows and I thought, man, that would be great if I could put my science hat on and work on that. And I remember talking extensively with my mother, who's no longer with us, unfortunately, but she was a big driver of this. She explained to me that, there's a higher mission than just making money in a pharmaceutical company, and you have a chance to do good things and help people and the whole 9 yards. And she was 100% right. And she said, if it's worth doing, it's worth trying to do. And to those whom much is given, much is expected. And she made me think that there was a higher calling and a higher mission to be fulfilled. And she was absolutely right. So I turned to the FBI and made the effort, and I got accepted and worked as hard as I possibly could ever since then.
She was a wise woman.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
When did you retire and what are you doing now?
I retired in October of this year. I'm a recent retiree, so I'm still kind of figuring out what my next steps are. I wanted to take a little downtime. Obviously, you work very hard for 24 years. I just wanted to see what it was like to be retired and relax and spend my days not being stressed out I still have, the occasional call about jobs and security and corporate America and things like that that come through, and I'm still fielding those calls. But I'm working on setting up my own consulting company, Investigative Consulting. I'll be working towards that goal. I'll be setting that up early next year and then maybe doing some work along those lines too. I have a couple other media invites that I'll be addressing also in the near future to talk about this case and several others that I've been involved with over the years.
Great. I like to give my guests the last word. What would you like to say?
I want to say thank you, first of all, for giving me the opportunity to talk about what happened with this case. Obviously, I'm very passionate about it. This was 5 years of my life. This was an opportunity to speak for our team, which I was glad to do. We were always happy and took every opportunity we could to speak about what happened here to the rest of the country, because again, most people have no idea that this is happening under their noses. I'm grateful for that opportunity. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have been an FBI special agent for all those years and to have made a difference.
And that's the end of the interview. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode to the show notes, where you'll find a photo of Kurt McKenzie, photos of Chris and Jeff George, and a few evidence photos from the case. I traveled down the pill mill rabbit hole, so there's lots of links to news articles and videos about Operation Oxy Alley. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked the episode by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can go to my website and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the right-hand corner. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. This podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my monthly email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI, books written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. Nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist of 20 cliches about the FBI. I would love it if you also checked out the link for my books. My FBI for Armchair Detectives nonfiction series enables readers to discover who the FBI is and what the FBI does, debunking misconceptions about the FBI, found in books, TV, and movies. And my Philadelphia FBI Corruption Squad procedural series features flawed female FBI agent Carrie Wheeler. My books are available as ebooks, paperbacks, and audiobooks wherever books are sold. And if you've already picked up copies, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams.